Welcome back, everybody. I hope you're doing okay. Hope you're healthy and psychologically handling all of this well. So we have two topics we're going to cover today. Number one is omniscience, the idea that God is all-knowing, and its relationship to our free will. That's topic one. Topic two is eternity. God is eternal. What does that mean? Those two things are tightly related enough that I thought it would make more sense to put them all together into one quick lecture. All right. Omniscience first. The classic question here is, if God is all-knowing, do we have free will? For some people, this is seemed not to raise any problems at all. St. Augustine famously thought that what God knows when he knows your future is your free choice. So if you choose X tomorrow and God knows it now, then what he knows tomorrow is something you freely chose. So why not? What's wrong with that? Maybe there's nothing wrong with that. That's the question for omniscience. Can it coexist with your free will? Here's the problem. Here's why it's thought to raise problems contra St. Augustine for freedom. It starts with what knowledge is. Knowledge has parts. Classically, it's thought to have at least three parts. This goes back to Plato and a dialogue called the Theaetetus. Knowledge is JTB. Let me write that down so that might sound abstract. Knowledge is justified true belief. Justified true belief. True belief plus a logos. It's very simple, but it's not simple at all because each of those three things contains multitudes. Truth is hard. There are different theories of truth. Maybe truth is just correspondence to reality. Somehow I say things, I say words. Words are just noises. Letters on a whiteboard are just ink. And yet they mean things. And when words mean things, what is that? Maybe it's a picture. I say giraffes are tall, and you picture, psychologically imagine a giraffe of a certain form, and the closer that picture corresponds to the thing out there in Africa, the truer your thought becomes. Maybe that's what truth is. Lots of what we say is not picturable, though. Lots of what we say is more abstract than that, numbers and... So truth is complicated, but if you know a thing, it had better be true. Part two, you had better believe it. You can't know a thing you don't even believe. So goes the classical thinking. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe you know things you don't believe all the time. I think you can imagine cases of this where, you take a test and you think you remember that the answer is 1842, and you did see 1842. You read the textbook, and that is imprinted in your mind, but you doubt yourself. If somebody asked if you really believe this, you say, I don't know, I don't really believe it, but you knew it. You just didn't know that you knew it, and yet you knew it. Does knowledge really require belief? Maybe not. Does God believe things? So all of this is, we're doing two jobs at once here. We want to get clear on what knowledge is as humans use the word, and what God's knowledge is like. God's knowledge is probably very different than yours and mine, if knowledge is even the right word. Probably all of our language about God is analogical. It's analogies and metaphors and doesn't quite fit. Knowledge is a human word, and when we talk about what it means to know things, it means we believe things. Some of our beliefs are false. Maybe knowledge is the true ones. But then you can believe things that are true without knowing them. You can believe things that are true accidentally. You can believe things that are true through sheer delusion. And yet, lucky you, the world turned out to match your delusion. That is not knowledge. Knowledge is when you believe things that are true for the right reason in the right way. And that is the J in JTD. How do you believe this? How did you get from here to there? I'd say most of the ink in the history of the study of knowledge has been spent on what we mean when we call a belief justified. Our way of knowing things is very likely different than God's. I mean, not likely, surely different than God's way of knowing things. That, by the way, is why today's talk about omniscience and the next lecture on eternity are getting smushed together into one thing today. Eternity classically is thought to have a lot to do with how God knows things. God knows things from outside time in the Orthodox picture. We'll get there. We'll get into what that means. So what does any of this have to do with free will? Well, following your Nelson Pike article here, we can lay it out pretty basically this way. If God knows things, then he believes them, and they're true. That's simple enough. That's just what it means to know things. But he also knows them ahead of time. If you do something today, say freely, or it feels freely, God didn't learn it today. God knew it yesterday. God knew it 100 years ago. God has always known what you do today. So are you free? Well, let's think about what freedom would mean. One classic way of understanding freedom, the libertarian theory of freedom. Let me write that down because when we get a word that specific, I want you to see it. Libertarian, like the political party, but it is not the political party. Libertarian freedom is freedom that involves the power to make things different than they are. That may just sound like what free will is to you, but not all people who believe in free will are libertarians. Not all of them believe that it involves the power to make things otherwise. Libertarians think that's exactly what it means. It's a strange theory in a certain way. It says that your actions are indeterminate. They have no causes. They don't follow laws. They don't... you are a prime mover unmoved, is the one classic way to put it. When you act freely on the libertarian picture, nothing makes you go left rather than right. Nothing makes you choose A rather than B. So your actions have no cause. They have no If they have no cause, they probably have no explanation. They've got no origin. They come from nowhere. Maybe they come from you somehow. But what are you? Do they come from your thoughts and desires? Well, your thoughts and desires came from somewhere. And if they came from somewhere, then that would determine what they do. And so the libertarian has to say, in some sense, that your actions come from nothing. So libertarian free will is what I think it's what most people, before they start thinking about it too much, think free will is. It means I can do X or I could do not X. Right? So let's take Nelson Pike's example. Jones mows his lawn on Saturday. If God is all-knowing, then he knew 100 years ago that Jones would mow his lawn on Saturday. And so the question is, if Jones is free, if he has free will, does he have the power to refrain from doing what God knows? That would be a strange power. It would be the power to make something. Let's back up to 100 years ago. 100 years ago, God already knows that Jones will mow his lawn today. So, Jones walks up to the lawnmower and he decides to walk away and go drink a beer. When he does that, what was implied by God's knowledge 100 years ago? Well, if God knew this 100 years ago, then 100 years ago it was already true. What you're going to do tomorrow is true today, and God believes it today. So, this innocuous-looking power to not mow your lawn turns into the power to make God have a false belief, or to make something that is already true not true. If God already knows it, then it's already true. Now you may say, well, maybe he knows I was going to walk away. Fine. Then you don't have the power to mow your lawn, because if you had that power, you would have the power to make something God knows not true, or to make something God knows something he doesn't actually believe. So, maybe that's not what freedom is. This is an old problem, and Nelson Pike didn't discover it in the 1960s. One way to wiggle out of this problem, maybe, is to give up the idea that freedom means you can do otherwise. Maybe you're totally free, even if God knows what you're going to do, if free will is determinate in some way. So, let me give you a metaphor on this. Let me give you an analogy, I guess. I have a mother. Hi, Mom, if you're watching. I couldn't have had a different mother, but that doesn't mean that this mother isn't mine. She's mine. It would be absurd to think that just because some other person couldn't be my mother, that this one isn't mine. She's my mother, and I don't need to be able to have a different one to make her mine. Okay? So when someone says you have to be able to choose differently to have free will, why? If this was my choice, even if God knew that choice in advance, even if everything about that choice is determined by my nature and by my beliefs and my upbringing and my genetics, and if everything I do is caused and God knows it ahead of time, it's still my choice. And maybe it makes no more sense than in the mother's story to say I have to be able to make a different choice to make this choice mine. No, if I made a different choice, I would be a different me. I am this guy, and this guy chose that, and that's my choice, and that's what freedom is. So we call that kind of story compatibilist. Compatibilists think we make choices. They're free if they come from inside you. And you don't have to be able to choose differently to have a choice really be yours. So, if you're a compatibilist, God's omniscience has no impact on your free will. But it means you believe in determinism, that God knows your future and your future is fixed. It's true tomorrow. It's true today, what you're going to do tomorrow, because God knows it today, and if God knows something, then it's already true, and he already believes it. So, if God knows your future, then having the power to make it different would be the power to make God not know what he knows. That's the problem. As it's classically set up, you have a choice to make. You can give up one or the other, if they really are in tension in the way the argument seems to imply they are. You can give up this libertarian free will and say that my future is determined. Maybe you believe in a more limited compatibilist free will of the kind I was describing, where your future's not open, but it's still yours and driven by your choices. That could be one choice you make. Or you could abandon God's foreknowledge. You could say that God doesn't know things ahead of time. Maybe there's nothing to know about the future. Maybe God knows all truths. That's what omniscience is. He knows all truths, but the future isn't true yet. This is what Aristotle thought, basically, that there is no truth about the future until the future comes. So, maybe God doesn't know your future because it's not there to be known yet. Once you do it, it'll become true, and then God will know it. That seems to many people, me included, to be a pretty religiously, not just philosophically, but religiously powerful limit on God's knowledge. Even if it's true that he knows all things that there are to know, and this isn't included in it, like logically makes sense maybe, it adds up. But it doesn't religiously make sense to think God doesn't know your future, because so much of the promise of God is built around his guarantees of your future. He will raise you from the dead. He will offer you an absolution of your sins. He will X, Y, Z. None of that providence, that promise of a particular future, can really be had if God doesn't know the future. So it seems like you have a problem. And the easier thing to give up, classically, is maybe free will. You're going to have to go back and think about what that means for a lot of other problems we've talked about. The problem of evil, for one big one. But Nelson Pike wants to lay out the underpinnings of that choice. He's not telling you which way to go with the choice. He's trying to argue that given certain assumptions about how knowledge works, assumptions that might be false, but given those assumptions, you do have a choice to make between the kind of free will that means your future is open and God's knowledge of the future, which closes it, because it's already true. Okay. Part 2. How does God know your future? The classic way to answer that question is to say that God is atemporal, that he stands outside time. Let's start with space first as a metaphor. It makes no sense, I think, to most people to say that God is in space. He's not in Russia, he's not in China, he's not in Washington, he's not anywhere. Is he anywhere in time? Well, by analogy, no. He's not in 1962, he's not at any moment, he's outside time in the same way we think maybe not in the same way, but we have other things we think are not temporal, but nevertheless real. Numbers. The number 2 is not a thing that gets older, that has a birthday and a death day. It's abstract and frozen and outside space and time. It's an idea. God's not supposed to be just an idea. He's supposed to have more power and impact on reality than mere ideas, but he's supposed to be atemporal in that same way. What does that mean? One way, I'm going to draw it. Here's you moving through time. Past, present, future. God sees them all now to him. What does now to him mean? I don't know. Maybe now is the wrong word, but your past he's looking at the same time as he's looking at your future and your present, as though you were one extended thing to him. This is time. He's not in it, he's outside it, and he sees your future now. Why? Why do people think of God's relationship to time that way? 1, he seems greater if he's not bound by time. 2 is to try to solve this free will problem. If tomorrow this is the choice I make, and he knows it by looking at it, then his knowledge of the future is not that different than my knowledge of what the person out my window is doing. I see them, but I don't make them do anything. They do what they do freely. I don't know that this really resolves the free will problem, but it helps you understand how God could watch someone do something freely without interfering or making them do anything or taking away their freedom. The question still is, does this guy have the ability to go this way instead of this way? If God already sees where he is now. If God sees what you're doing now, do you have the ability to make that picture different in the future? Probably not. But it does give you a picture of how he knows your future. He sees you acting in some sense freely, even if freedom doesn't mean you have the power to do otherwise. That picture of God outside time is called the atemporal, A-T-E-M-P-O-R-A-L, picture of God. There are deeper other reasons to believe it's true, apart from its impact on God's knowledge. God is immutable. God cannot change. If God changed, he would change for the better or worse. If he changed for the better, he would have been less good before. If he changes for the worse, he becomes less good now. And either way, God is not perfect. So if God changes, God can't be perfect. Time is change. So God cannot be bound by time. That's problem one. Problem two, if God changes, he loses or gains some quality. How? What could make God lose or gain a quality? Something inside him or something outside him? If something outside God changed God, then that thing is in control of God, and God is not sovereign. If something inside God changes God, then God's qualities are not sovereign either, because they're accidental. They're not driven by his nature. If some quality in you is driven by your own nature, you can't lose it without ceasing to exist. A triangle can't lose a side without ceasing to be a triangle. If God's essential properties change, he ceases to be God. God's not an accidental thing, so he cannot change. And it's thought to most people that the only way to guarantee the idea that God is not a changing, disappearing being is to make him atemporal, to make him outside this world of flux and flow and rivers you can't step into twice. There are dissenters from this point of view. The alternative picture of God's eternity is the sempiternal picture. Let me write that word down. Sempiternal. You could think of this as the everlasting God. A word for you. Sempiternal. Handwriting probably made that worse rather than better, but the sempiternal God moves through time, was never born and never dies, but is nevertheless in this moment with us. The sempiternal God is not in the future now. He is not in the past now. He is not looking at Socrates and Moses now. And he doesn't see the future now. He is with us in the present. But he was never born and he never dies. The sempiternal God changes. He listens to prayers and then answers them. Maybe he could die and then 3 days later rise from the dead. All those things are changing. All those things are temporal. All those things raise exactly the kind of issues that I asked about a minute ago. Does he change for the better or worse? What qualities does he gain or lose? Were they accidental or essential? But the kind of God who could appear in a burning bush and talk to Moses seems to be the kind of thing that is in time. The kind of thing that could be incarnated as Jesus and then go through a human life seems to be in time. So what does eternal mean? Does it mean everlasting, or does it mean timeless, outside time? Those two questions were obviously related to the last two about how God knows your future, because your future is a time question, and how God sees it is related to the kind of thing that God is. So, I'll post the questions about these on the discussion board in a few minutes. I'll also copy and put up the readings for you in case you don't have them still. Once again, I hope you guys are staying healthy, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.